While I typically do very analytical tournament type content with the EU's Masters being announced as well as these seasonal tournaments in client, I think it's important for me to diversify into ladder a little bit, or just sort of more general content that's not strictly tournament focused, because now how you play the game is going to affect your qualifications for tournaments. So that said, I'm putting out my first deck guide. So I'm going to be doing a full dive into this Targon Lee Sin deck. Now I'm going to be honest with y'all, I've done a lot of card games in the past, never really written a deck guide, but I've been reading a lot of deck guides lately, and I know what I want out of one, so that's what I'm going to be giving you here today. But that said, it's still me, I'm still a caster. I know that you don't want to see me play the game, so there's no gameplay included in this guide. You're not going to see me play the deck, you're just going to hear me talk about the individual choices. There are a lot of Lee Sin builds running around, so what I'm going to do is kind of tell you every card that fits into every Lee Sin deck, and then the cards that are mandatory and optional. The cards that are mandatory in a Lee Sin deck are Lee Sin, Duh, Zenith Blade, Eye of the Dragon, Deep Meditation, Deny and Bastion, Hush, Pale Cascade and Guiding Touch, some form of Gem Generation, and your Celestial Generation. And then for your optional cards we have Zed, Claws of the Dragon, Tasty Feyfolk, Sonic Wave, Retreat, Key Guardian, Sun-Blessed Vigor, and Twin Disciplines, Concussive Palm, and Behold the Infinite. So the mandatory cards are cards that you're going to find in 95 to 100% of Lee Sin decks. I think the only card you're actually going to find in everyone is Lee Sin himself. And then the optional cards fall around more the 75-80% range, sometimes a lot less, but Behold the Infinite definitely looks like something that looks a little bit weird on that list, but it's not in as many Lee Sin decks as you might think, which I'll get into later. But first we're going to start off with the mandatory cards, sort of the cards that you have to play in your Lee Sin deck if you are going to be finding the success that most people have with the deck. So Lee Sin, this is your main win condition. This is the namesake card of the deck. It really doesn't need any explanation why it's in the Targon Lee Sin deck. Zenith Blade is one of the main reasons that we're in Targon, giving you that overwhelm and allowing you to enable that one-shot combo. There's a lot of talk about whether you should be running 2 or 3 copies. Personally, I like the full 3 copies, because if I clog up on multiple copies of Zenith Blade, then I don't have to daybreak the additional copies. And there's a lot of times where I'll play something like a Zed on 3, and I have my banked spell mana, and I have 2 Zenith Blade in hand, and it actually feels really good not to have to daybreak this card. I think it's actually incomparable to some of the other cards in a similar category, like Squadron Hawk is sort of the first time this kind of argument came to me personally. And I think that because this card does something other than just search copies of itself, you should be playing the full 3 copies, and this is what allows you to pillar on other units in a deck like this. Even if you're not playing Zed, you can pillar on something like a Goat or a Tasty Feyfolk, and that +2 health as well as the overwhelm is really what lets you do that and play the game until you find that Lee Sin and maybe somehow eke out a win. Even something gotten off a Solari Priestess like a Warrior or a Golden Sisters, you give that Zenith Blade and it suddenly feels like a potential realistic win con. And if you're not having Zenith Blade down on a unit, it doesn't feel like you can actually win the game with that. So I do really love the full 3 copies. Then we have Eye of the Dragon. This is literally the kind of deck that Eye of the Dragon was made for. It's relatively weak to aggro. It wants to constantly play 2 spells in a turn because we finally have a cantrip regen. That's really all there is to say about it. Deep Meditation, similar vein, mandatory. This is the deck it was made for, one of the few +1s in the deck inherently. Bastion and Deny are the big protection spells for the deck, as this does sort of feel like a combo deck. Bastion being better than Deny. Generally, we're seeing 3 Bastion and 2 Deny. If you've been living under a rock or you don't know what this deck does or why Bastion's such a big deal, this was recently buffed to give a unit +1/+1 and a permanent spell shield instead of just a temporary spell shield. So one of the biggest buffs to a card that was already relatively okay, and that really pushed this deck to the front of the meta. Obviously, if you're going to run a combo deck, you want to run protection, and these 2 regions have the most protection in the game. Hush is just sort of a Targon staple that you're going to run at least a one of in every Targon deck. Doesn't do anything incredible for the Lee Sin specifically, but it is one of your ways to pop through Bastions. Pale Cascade and Guiding Touch are the best Lee Sin activators. They're pretty non-committal. They let you cycle through your deck to find the Lee Sin. These and Bastion are the main reasons that we're in Targon. The 2 spells in a turn archetype is insane when piled with a self-replacing cheap spell archetype like Targon, especially ones that are combat tricks for some reason. And yes, Guiding Touch is a combat trick. The heal on the unit actually comes up a lot to dodge removals. Keep your Lee Sin healthy and make it so that you don't have to constantly commit barrier to Lee Sin when you're going for that early game board control before he's actually leveled. Then we have the Gem Generators, Gift Giver, Mountain Goat, and Mentor of Stones. Every elite deck that I've seen is playing at least one of these. Generally, they're playing 2. It's really up to you which ones you want to do. you want some kind of gem generation, as it's the best way to turbo the Lee Sin level up, and healing units makes it safer to use a pre-leveled Lee as a board control tool without having to commit 2 spells like I had mentioned with Guiding Touch. You can kind of play with Lee Sin's health total a little bit and then just jam a couple of gems into him. Personally, I like Mountain Goat and Mentor of Stones the best, but as we'll see as we get into the optional cards, you can really start to dog up on 3-drops, as well as Mentor being pretty bad against Noxus Bilgewater. Even though you get the gems, trading 3 real mana for 2 spell mana in a Make It Rain feels terrible, especially if they have an established board already, which they probably will by turn 3. Gift Giver is the safe pick, as it's really low commitment and you get the free gem immediately, but it's also really low impact, both as a blocker and as a card in general. Feels a lot better now with the Petty Officer nerf, but I still prefer Mountain Goat. I feel like if you could main deck a gem instead of Gift Giver, you wouldn't do it, but I wouldn't think less of you if you did. Goat, given that Bastion is in your deck, no one really uses the cheap removal on the Goat since they'll need it later to pop the Bastion, but he's not guaranteed to get you a gem, but he can get you multiple gems. He's still my favorite because I hate aggro, and a 2-mana 3/2 is a great way to fight for board. And of course, Mentor, slow and greedy. Sometimes greed is good. It also gives you the most gems to speedrun the Lee Sin, but like I said, it is a little vulnerable to a lot of different kinds of strategies, and it can definitely be difficult to actually have it survive into the attack to buff up an impactful unit. Because you're running gem generators, you've got some decent discard targets, and as we'll see as we get into the optional cards for the deck, sometimes you've got some dead mid to late game picks in your deck, so you can go ahead and get rid of those with the Sketcher. And honestly, you're looking more for utility here. Trickster is generally going to be grabbed as a blocker for things like a Zap Spray Fin. You're not really looking to pillar on a Trickster. Moonsilver and Moonglow also phenomenal. Crescent Strike, of course, going to help you against aggro. And, you know, if you really want to, you can go for a Messenger to just try and quickly cycle through your deck and get to that Lee Sin just a smidge faster. Solari Priestess to me is the card that makes the Lee Sin matchup feel hopeless for a lot of decks. If you're not Targon Ionia and you're trying to play some counter Lee Sin strategy, I feel like this is the card that's going to throw the wrench in your works the most often. Comet is a devastating spell for Swain decks, Deep decks, War Mother's Call, Endure. Really any non-Ionia, non-Targon, non-aggro deck is just going to get completely wiped by a card like that. Written in Stars is one of the most sort of obvious arguments for running mono Lee Sin, guaranteeing that you'll get him, making him bigger, makes him cost less mana so that you can get your combo down earlier, or just set up a bigger combo turn with more protection. Warrior presents a fair amount of pressure onto opposing Lee Sins without having to commit any spells of your own. You get the idea, but the main tool feels like Comet against any non-aggro, non-lead deck, and that's sort of one of the main reasons that I think this deck feels so good, is just ripping those Comets out of Solari Priestess really holds down a lot of matchups. Zed is the best secondary win condition in Ionia Targon. Overwhelm counts as a Nexus Strike, which matters a little bit, but generally people just block the clone at that point. But once leveled, the clone will have Overwhelm, and that is something that can come up, so Zenith Blade really doubles down on this card. It's not the easiest to pillar on due to its low health total, but definitely not impossible. It helps in the games where you struggle to find Lee Sin, gives you that option to try and race aggro decks. And one very interesting use that I've actually seen for this card is a player had their Lee Sin locked down by an Infinite Mind Splitter, so the player played a Zed and then shadow shifted the Lee Sin back to their hand to actually unlock it from the Mind Splitter. And it's not really a play that's going to come up too often, but it is, you know, sort of flexing the flexibility of this card, and certain optional cards are seen more in one version than the other. Personally, I was pretty quick to drop the Zed version after a few bad games, but I'll cover how each card fits into either strategy. Personally, I found that in the Lee mirror, the Zed usually tries to prey on non-Lee openers, which feels fragile if they draw the Lee at any point before you kill them, because it's unlikely that your Zed is actually going to survive the Lee Sin even without the Dragon's Rage, unless you've gotten down multiple Zenith Blades on this unit. And for the most part, I've found that the life totals are pretty irrelevant as you both sort of look to one-shot each other with the Lee Sin. Of course, the damage you both push does mean your Lee doesn't need to be as big in order to actually deal the finishing blow, but I really haven't found it to be a massive difference maker in games where both players actually do find their Lee Sins. Pretty cut and dry is Claws of the Dragon as an anti-aggro tech. I've never been a big fan of this card, but it does cut a turn or two off of your opponent's life total in the Lee mirror if you're on the Zed plan where neither of you have opened a Lee Sin, but I'm definitely not a huge fan of this card in the mono Lee Sin version. I think there are better anti-aggro cards. by which I mean Tasty Fey Folk. It's a pretty cut and dry anti-aggro tech again, and it costs 3 mana, so you do have to be aware of how many 3-drops you're putting into your deck, like I had mentioned with things like Zed and Mentor of Stones, because you're always going to be running Solari Priestess, so you really do have to be, keep that in the back of your head when you're actually fleshing out your deck. Maybe cut one of them. A very strong anti-aggro pillar with the Zenith Blade, but by no means mandatory. It's really more of a ladder tech than a tournament tech for sure. I've really only seen Sonic Wave in the Zed version to help in board-centric matchups, so you can take advantage of having a 5-attack, quick attack challenger that also pushes 5 damage, which honestly is a lot for a 2-card combo, and it's very reasonable for you to do that on turn 3 with the attack token, but it really hasn't made its way into the mono Lee Sin versions because there's really nothing for you to give challenger and the resonating strike to that's going to be nearly as impactful as when a Zed does it. Retreat is a consistent out in the Lee Sin mirror to dodge the OTK, as it can only be stopped by deny, and it's in really slow matchups you can try and recycle things like a Solari Priestess, but because the return doesn't actually let her invoke a Celestial, I don't really recommend it. It's definitely a little bit better in the Zed version because he is vulnerable to removal, and the return putting in Zed is probably one of the best case uses for a card like that. The reason you're not seeing it too often anymore is because if your opponent pulls your Lee Sin and you retreat it back to your hand, you're resetting the stats on it as well as getting rid of the overwhelm on it, so one-shotting your opponent again becomes very difficult, and it's like, yeah, you were gonna lose if you didn't have retreat, but you're probably going to continue to lose anyway because your Lee Sin no longer has as big stats. Key Guardian is really something you only run if you've been burned too many games in a row by not drawing your Lee Sin and you needed those extra few cantrips, and for some reason you just wanted to play this instead of Zed. I'm not a fan of it. I haven't seen it in any tournament lists, but it does pop up on ladder a lot, and so far I haven't really been impressed by it. But if you do just want to go all in on draw as many cards as I possibly can, Key Guardian's a not terrible option. These are just to offer a little bit of extra protection if you're in a meta where you're seeing a lot of removal. I like Sunblessed in either version of the deck, but I really only like Twin Disciplines when you're running the Zed version. Adding 6 damage to an overwhelmed leveled Zed is pretty tough for a lot of decks to handle, especially at the cheap mana cost. And Sunblessed isn't super popular, but it does feel really good in the games where you need to pillar up on something secondary like the Zed or the Tasty Fey Folk. I think that if you're running into a lot of aggro and you want to throw something like 3 Sunblessed Vigor and 3 Tasty Fey Folk in your deck, it's not the most unreasonable thing in the world and can actually help you a lot, as that 4 lifesteal is really good, but the 2 health on it is pretty vulnerable to a lot of things. Even Bilgewater doesn't necessarily have a hard time dealing with it because of a kegged up Make It Rain. You are pretty lacking in removal in a deck like this, so kegs can really do a lot of damage to you, and Sunblessed is going to help you out with that. This card is pretty unanimously played alongside the Mono Lee version, but not in the Zed one, meaning that it's never really going to be played alongside Retreat, which is a little unfortunate conceptually, but is what it is. This card sort of acts as the oh shit button when you attack your Lee into something, and through Hush or some other kinds of means, your Lee is suddenly vulnerable and in a bad spot. You can go ahead and stun out the thing that you challenged, and of course, also acts as this great anti-aggro tool, just stun out a big guy. Pretty good against decks like that want a pillar that are weak to Comet, like Endure and War Mothers and things of that nature. But aside from that, I do want to talk about attacking with your Lee Sin and putting it in danger, and go off on a little tangent here about target selection for your OTK. When you're going for the one-shot and your opponent has a full board, what you pick to kill them with matters. The main questions to ask yourselves are, can they kill the unit that I'm attacking? This mostly comes up versus Noxus and Shadow Isle being able to Vile Feast or Unspeakable Horror, and of course Glimpse beyond the unit. And in Noxus you do have to watch out for Noxian Fervor, because if the unit dies, the kick does nothing and you only get the overwhelm damage. One that comes up in the mirror a lot since they can't kill their own units is, what unit do I want to kill if they have Deny for the kick? What unit do I want to kick if they have Hush? And what unit will my Lee Sin not die to if I get Hushed and Bastioned and sort of everything goes wrong here? Because it's not unreasonable by any means for your opponent to have Hush and Bastion or Deny for the kick. So if you go for your opponent's Lee Sin, it's a great kick target for the stat reset, but it's the only card in their deck that'll probably kill your Lee Sin. Attacking their Lee Sin is a pretty low risk, pretty high reward play, but it's not risk free. And I sort of just want to get you thinking about the cards in your hand, the card that your opponent could have. If my Lee Sin actually does die here, do I have an answer for their Lee Sin? Things of that nature. If you go for something like an Eye of the Dragon, this will realistically never threaten to kill your Lee Sin, but the potential gain isn't that high either, and I really just want to get you thinking about the kick targets that you have available to you, which one is sort of the lowest risk, highest reward, and just sort of not have you tunnel vision in on that, because sometimes people just grab whatever is all the way to the left or all the way to the right, and 9 times out of 10 it's not going to make a difference, but sort of I feel like the point of guides is to get you that last 1/10. So first of all, Behold the Infinite is great because it has the least text in a card game and is still a very good card. You always love to see it. It's not common in the Zed version. It's in pretty much every mono Lee Sin deck at this point. While all the good cards from the Solari Priestess pool are up and available to you, it's not out of the question for the Scourge to basically solo end a game, because you generally end up with these really wide, really useless boards in the mirror, especially if you have a Zenith Blade to go on top of that and give it self-overwhelm. And while that's not a very common play, I feel like there is someone who has won a Lee Sin mirror that way before. For the most part, though, it functions as a 2-mana Lee Sin activator that you're a lot more willing to slam than Guiding Touch or Pale Cascade as your first spell of the turn. The Celestial cards feel like the final nail in the coffin for a lot of decks, but being a 2-mana cantrip is good enough for the Lee Sin deck. This card's on the optional list because it's not in every Zed version, but personally when I play Lee Sin, I prefer to play the more Celestial heavy version. That said, Star Shaping is hyper trolling, it's really expensive, and while the more costly Celestials have their uses, I am generally not looking for them. I am looking for things in the Solari Priestess pool, even some of the utility things I could get off Spacey Sketcher, but really for that 7 and up cost, I'm really trying to avoid that pool if I can. Of course, I can randomly end the game, especially if my Lee Sin combo got half stopped and I put my opponent down to 10. I can just grab a Great Beyond, even the Destroyer sometimes, depending on the cards in my hand. It's definitely got a lot of uses. I absolutely love this card. I would love to have it on the mandatory list, but like I said, not every Zed version is running it, so this is optional if you're running Zed. But if you're running the Lee Sin, because that Celestial win con is something that's realistically available to you, as well as just being a great activator for the Lee, I definitely think you have to have 3 copies of this card. And Lunari Priestess, I mean, while we're talking about cards that invoke, I feel like it's not trolling, but I don't see why you would be running that over Zed, because you are invoking for a secondary win con with a card like that, and I feel like Zed just fits that 3-drop slot so much better. And you definitely don't run Lunari Priestess and Zed. Don't tell them. If you do that, don't tell them that Boulevard told you to do that. I'm telling you not to do it. And thus brings us to the end of my first guide. This is normally where the gameplay would go, but as I had mentioned at the beginning, I feel like that doesn't really add anything to it for you, and you don't really want to see me play. Also, I didn't give you a list to run, I just kind of laid out the options for you, so this is where you go and experiment with your LP with the deck and figure out what you like and how you want to run it and personalize it, because there's a lot of personalization in Legends of Runeterra. I've laid out a lot of great options for you to build your own personalized Lee Sin deck. Go, climb, get to Masters, climb the Masters ladder, whatever you end up doing. And definitely let me know if this was a formatting for guides that you guys liked. As I had said, you know, maybe that gameplay aspect of it really does tie it all together, and that's something that I need to include in the future. But thank you guys so much for watching. Follow me on Twitter from the BLVD if you don't know who I am. I'm a caster. I cast all the time. Follow me on Twitter, figure out when and where it's happening. Pretty much casting something every weekend, a lot of times during the week as well. So my name is Boulevard. Until next time, good luck in your tournaments.